The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the wide training ground. The air carried the sharp smell of dust and fresh grass, stirred by the boots of dozens of trainees standing in perfect lines. The sound of silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the cry of a bird flying overhead. Everyone knew that roll call was not just about numbers. It was about order, discipline, and the unspoken rule that no one was ever left behind. The instructor's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Strong and steady, it carried across the field as he called out names one by one. Each trainee answered with a firm "present," and the cubs, though smaller and less disciplined, tried their best to mimic the same energy. Some of them stood tall on their little feet, puffing out their chests, while others nervously clutched their hands, unsure if they were loud enough to be heard. Everything seemed to move smoothly until the instructor's eyes narrowed at the end of the list. He repeated the count, scanning the lines with a careful gaze. Then he did it again, slower this time. A slight tension crept into the air as whispers started spreading among the trainees. 3 cubs were missing. For a moment, it felt unreal. The training ground, always a place of strict order, now carried a ripple of confusion. Heads turned left and right. Some of the trainees craned their necks, trying to spot small figures hidden between rows. But the truth was clear. The 3 cubs were nowhere to be seen. The instructor's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. He asked the lines to stay steady and ordered another round of counting. The numbers didn't lie. 3 young ones were gone. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with questions nobody dared to ask aloud. Among the rows, the human trainees began to exchange worried glances. A missing cub was not a small matter. They were not just learners. They were the future, the ones who needed protection and guidance. Losing them, even for a short time, felt like a failure to everyone standing there. The instructor took a step forward, his boots pressing hard against the ground, as if to remind everyone that panic was not an option. His calm presence steadied the group, but his sharp eyes revealed the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Each cub was precious, each life counted, and now 3 were unaccounted for. The wind carried a faint rustle through the trees at the edge of the field, and some heads instinctively turned in that direction. Perhaps the cubs had wandered off. Perhaps they were hiding, playing, or simply lost in curiosity. But deep down, everyone understood that this was more than a game. Order had been broken, and finding those 3 cubs was no longer just a task. It was a test of trust and unity for all who stood in that ground. The air around the training ground was already heavy with unease after the missing cubs were discovered. Trainees shifted uncomfortably, trying to keep their focus straight ahead, though every mind was racing with questions. In the middle of this tense silence, a young human trainee suddenly felt something odd. She reached for her backpack, the one she had placed carefully at her side earlier that morning, but her hand touched nothing but grass and dust. Her backpack was gone. At first, she thought maybe she had left it somewhere else, but she clearly remembered carrying it when she lined up. Her heartbeat quickened as she glanced around, hoping to spot it under someone's feet or lying forgotten behind the row. But it was nowhere. The realization struck harder because of the timing. Just when everyone was unsettled about the missing cubs, now a backpack had vanished too. Whispers started rising among the lines, quiet at first, but soon spreading like ripples across water. A few heads turned toward the trainee, their eyes wide with curiosity and worry. Some even exchanged nervous looks as if trying to connect the 2 incidents. "Could it be a coincidence?" one voice murmured. "No, it can't be," another whispered. The instructors noticed the change in the group's mood. Their sharp eyes scanned the rows, looking for signs of panic. One of them raised a hand, demanding silence, but even silence could not calm the unease growing inside everyone's chest. The young trainee tried to stand steady, though her heart was racing. That backpack wasn't just a bag. It carried her notebook, rations, and a few personal things she never let out of her sight. Losing it under normal circumstances would have been frustrating. But losing it now, at the exact moment 3 cubs had gone missing, felt more like a warning. Some trainees began to whisper about whether the cubs had taken it, but others quickly dismissed the thought. The cubs were mischievous at times, yes, but they were not thieves. Besides, how could 3 of them disappear unnoticed and manage to take a backpack without anyone seeing? The mystery only deepened. The instructor's voice cut in again, strong and steady. He reminded everyone to stay calm, that order mattered more than fear. But even as he spoke, the lines of trainees felt less solid, like they could crumble with the next piece of bad news. The trainee without her backpack kept scanning the ground, her eyes darting from one end of the field to the other. Every shadow, every rustle of wind seemed suspicious now. She clenched her fists, not out of anger, but to stop them from shaking. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt certain this was not random. In that moment, the missing cubs and the missing backpack became part of the same puzzle. A quiet tension filled the air, pulling everyone closer to the edge of suspicion. No one dared to speak loudly, but the question was written on every face. What exactly was going on and who or what was behind it? The sound of boots stamping in rhythm had stopped. The drill, which was meant to sharpen discipline, now hung in silence. The instructors stood at the front, their eyes fixed on the empty space where 3 cubs should have been. For a few seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the soft whistle of the wind passing through the training ground. Instructors were not easily shaken. They had seen tired faces, broken lines, and even mistakes that cost dearly during training. But this was different. Cubs rarely left formation. If one did, it was often to grab attention or because something unusual had caught their senses. For 3 to vanish at once, quietly and without notice, meant there was more to it. The senior instructor let his arms drop to his sides. His steady gaze shifted to his fellow instructors, and they exchanged quick glances, silent but heavy with meaning. The younger instructors looked uneasy, shifting their weight from one boot to another. It wasn't just about the missing cubs anymore. It was about the message their disappearance carried. Among the trainees, unease grew like a ripple spreading across still water. They had never seen their instructors hesitate before. Usually, orders came sharp and quick, as though every second of hesitation was a weakness. But now, even the leaders seemed caught between worry and thought. That unsettled the group more than the missing cubs themselves. One of the instructors stepped forward and ordered the lines to stay firm. His voice was calm but had an edge that warned against disorder. He reminded them that panic would not help. Yet his eyes gave away what his voice hid. He was concerned. Deeply concerned. Some of the older trainees began whispering among themselves, wondering if the cubs had followed something beyond the trees or had been pulled away by curiosity. But curiosity rarely made cubs vanish without leaving a trace. The missing backpack from earlier was now circling in everyone's thoughts. Could the two things be linked? Was there someone or something deliberately testing their discipline? The instructors didn't speak their theories aloud, but their sharp movements told the story. They were alert, listening not just to the group, but to the world around them. The faint rustle of leaves, the call of a bird, the shift of air. Small details that others ignored became signals to them. Finally, the senior instructor straightened his shoulders and gave a firm command to hold formation until further notice. The cubs would be found, he said, but not at the cost of order. Discipline, even in moments of uncertainty, was the shield they had to rely on. The morning sun grew brighter, but the ground felt heavier under every foot. The missing cubs had turned the day from routine to uncertain, and the instructors knew this was more than a minor disruption. It was a sign that something important was waiting to be uncovered. The silence of the drill had turned into a restless buzz as orders were given. The instructors, once standing tall at the front, now broke formation and spread out, signaling the trainees to do the same. The search had begun. The empty ground, usually echoing with steady footsteps and sharp commands, now carried the sound of hurried movements and low voices calling out. The corridors that stretched around the training grounds felt strangely tense. Shadows seemed longer, and every corner held the weight of unanswered questions. Some trainees walked in pairs, scanning the ground and walls, while others peeked behind storage crates and open doors. The instructors moved with sharper eyes, every step deliberate, as if they expected something unusual to appear at any moment. No one knew whether they were searching for mischief or danger. Some hoped the cubs had simply wandered off to explore, perhaps chasing after a sound or following a game of their own. But the missing backpack reminded everyone that this could be more than simple play. If the two were connected, it meant someone, or something, was moving quietly among them. The young trainee whose backpack had disappeared walked with her eyes low but alert. Every corner made her heart beat faster. She thought about her belongings, but more than that, about the cubs. They were small, curious, and easily distracted. If they had left on their own, where would they go? And if they hadn't, then who had led them away? The instructors' voices rose and fell as they called for the cubs. The sound echoed against the stone corridors, traveling farther than sight could reach. Yet no small voices answered back. That silence weighed heavier than any shout. Some trainees began to exchange uneasy looks, wondering if they should prepare for trouble. A few whispered that maybe the cubs were hiding as part of a prank, though their tone carried more hope than belief. Others shook their heads, convinced this was something greater than mischief. The senior instructor stopped near a hallway and raised his hand for silence. The group froze. He tilted his head slightly, listening. A faint sound, soft, distant, reached their ears. It could have been the wind moving through the cracks, or it could have been something else. Without speaking, he gestured for two trainees to move forward, while the others stayed alert behind him. The search pressed on, careful but determined. Boots clicked against the floor, echoing with each step. Every turn of the corridor felt like it might reveal either the missing cubs or something none of them were ready to face. Though no answers had yet been found, one thing was certain. The morning was no longer about drills and discipline. It was about finding the cubs, restoring order, and uncovering what had pulled them away in the first place. The search was no longer just an action. It was a test, and everyone felt the weight of it. The large hall, usually filled with noise and steady movements, now sat in an unusual silence. The echo of footsteps faded as the search slowed, leaving only the sound of shallow breaths and the faint creak of wooden beams above. Everyone could feel the change in the air. It was thick, heavy, and stretched like a rope ready to snap. The cubs were nowhere to be found. Every corner had been checked, every corridor scanned, yet there was no sign of them. The longer they remained missing, the stronger the unease grew. The instructors, normally unshaken, now held their posture tighter than usual, as if they were hiding their concern behind discipline. The trainees, though trying to follow orders, could not help glancing nervously around the hall, as though expecting the cubs to suddenly appear from the shadows. For the young human trainee without her backpack, the silence felt sharper than a shout. She stood near one of the tall stone walls, her eyes moving constantly, trying to spot something, anything, that might explain both the missing cubs and her lost belongings. The thought kept circling in her mind. What if the two were connected? She wanted to believe it was all a coincidence, but the timing made it hard to dismiss. Her backpack had held simple things, nothing of great value to anyone else. But to her, it carried small pieces of comfort. Her notes, her ration pack, and a folded cloth she had carried since her first day of training. Losing it felt personal, almost as though someone had chosen to target her. And now, with the cubs gone, the hall felt colder, like an unseen presence was watching them all. The instructors called for quiet again, even though no one was speaking. Their instincts told them that noise might draw attention, not from the cubs, but from something else. The stillness that followed was more unsettling than before. Even the cubs' usual chatter, their restless energy, was missing. It was unnatural for young ones to remain silent for this long. The tension pressed down on everyone's shoulders. Some of the trainees tightened their fists, ready for orders, while others stood frozen, their eyes flicking toward every shadow. The wide hall, with its tall ceiling and open space, suddenly felt like a trap. Each sound, whether it was the distant drip of water or the brush of a sleeve, seemed louder than it should have been. The human trainee swallowed hard, trying to calm the uneasy beat of her heart. She wanted to ask aloud if anyone thought the cubs were safe, but the words stuck in her throat. In that silence, even questions felt dangerous. No answers came, and no cubs returned. The hall remained still, a stage set for something that had yet to reveal itself. The suspense deepened, holding everyone in place, as if the entire camp was waiting for the first sign of danger, of mischief, or of a truth none of them were ready to face. The silence in the hall stretched on until it felt almost unbearable. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. Then, breaking through the heavy stillness, came a sound, soft at first, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But as it grew clearer, every ear picked it up. Footsteps, light, uneven, and echoing against the stone corridor beyond the hall. Every head turned in the same direction. The air seemed to tighten as bodies stiffened, eyes fixed on the dark opening of the corridor. The sound wasn't the sharp stamp of boots. It was softer, scattered, almost like a mix of human steps and the patter of small paws. The trainees held their breath. Some shifted slightly, as though preparing to spring forward if ordered. The instructors exchanged quick glances. None of them spoke, but their expressions carried the same silent command. Stay alert. A hand rose, signaling everyone to hold their ground. The faint rhythm of approaching steps grew steadier. The long corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows swallowing whatever was coming. The young human trainee without her backpack felt her chest tighten. Her mind raced. Could it be the missing cubs, or was it something else? She clenched her fists at her sides, torn between hope and unease. The sound was close now, too close to ignore. The steps echoed unevenly, a strange mixture of weight and lightness. At times, they almost sounded playful, like cubs chasing each other. But then they shifted into a slower, heavier pace that didn't fit. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone's nerves. Some of the younger trainees whispered under their breath, their words barely more than a tremble. It's them. It has to be them. But others stayed quiet, their eyes narrowing, unwilling to trust hope so easily. The instructors moved forward, their boots firm against the ground. They positioned themselves between the corridor and the trainees, their bodies forming a steady wall of defense. Whatever was approaching, they would face it first. The footsteps came closer still. A shadow flickered against the wall, quick and unclear. The sound of paws against stone was unmistakable now, mixed with lighter, quicker steps. The hall grew even more tense. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting for the moment when the source of the sound would finally appear. The young trainee's heartbeat thudded in her ears. She felt every second stretch longer, every echo strike deeper. She knew something was about to happen. Whether it was relief or something far more troubling, none of them could tell. Then, just as the sound reached the edge of the hall, the steps stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. All eyes stayed locked on the corridor's opening, waiting for what would come through. The suspense held them frozen, balanced on the edge of discovery. All eyes stayed locked on the corridor's opening, hearts pounding as silence pressed down on the hall. Then from the shadows, 3 small figures slowly stepped into view. It was the cubs. Their tiny paws tapped softly against the floor as they walked out of the dim hallway into the light. Relief washed over the group like a sudden breeze, but the unease did not vanish. It only shifted. The cubs moved carefully, not in their usual playful, clumsy manner. They were quiet, their eyes lowered, as though they knew the weight of the moment. And then the detail no one could miss came into sight. Strapped across their small backs, held together awkwardly, was the human trainee's missing backpack. Gasps escaped from the lines of trainees. Some leaned forward in disbelief, while others exchanged quick glances. The young trainee who had lost her backpack felt her heart skip. She took a step forward without meaning to, her eyes fixed on the bag she had searched for since morning. The cubs struggled slightly under the weight. The straps dangled and shifted, clearly not made for their small bodies. Yet they carried it with surprising determination, as though the backpack itself held more meaning than anyone could understand. They stopped in the center of the hall, their tiny shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. The instructors, who had been standing firm at the front, kept their posture, though their eyes sharpened. The return of the cubs was a relief, but the questions multiplied. Why had they left formation? Why had they taken the bag? And why did they carry it back with such care instead of tossing it aside like a toy? The silence stretched again, but it was different now. It wasn't just suspense, it was expectation. Everyone waited for the instructors to speak, to demand answers, to make sense of what they were seeing. But even the instructors seemed to pause, studying the cubs with quiet attention. The young trainee stepped forward again, her voice low but steady. "That's mine," she said, more to herself than anyone else. The cubs lifted their heads slightly, their eyes meeting hers. For a moment, it was as though they were trying to say something without words, carrying not just a backpack, but also a message no one could yet understand. The hall was filled with emotions all tangled together: relief, curiosity, confusion, and a touch of unease. The cubs had returned, yes, but they had not come back the way anyone expected. Their slow, careful steps, their silence, and the backpack on their shoulders made it clear. Their disappearance had not been simple mischief. Everyone stood frozen, watching, waiting for the moment when the truth would begin to unfold. Whatever reason the cubs had for vanishing, it was carried inside that bag, and in their solemn little faces. The three cubs stood in the center of the hall, their small bodies still carrying the weight of the backpack. Every eye in the room followed their every move. The silence was so deep that even the faint sound of their breathing seemed loud. Slowly, they shuffled forward until they reached the young human trainee. Then, in a gesture no one expected, they lowered the backpack carefully to the ground. It wasn't dropped or tossed aside like an object of little value. Instead, it was placed gently at her feet, as though it was something important, something worth protecting. Their small paws lingered for a moment, steadying the bag, making sure it would not tip or fall. The cubs then stepped back slightly, their heads bowing in a quiet way that made the hall feel even heavier with emotion. It wasn't clumsy playfulness or mischief anymore. It was deliberate. It was almost like they were presenting the bag to her, not as thieves returning what they had taken, but as guardians delivering something that mattered. The young trainee stood frozen. Her breath caught in her chest as she stared at the backpack she thought was gone for good. The simple sight of it sitting safely at her feet, delivered by the smallest members of the group, sent a rush of emotions through her. She felt relief, yes, but also something much deeper. There was respect in the cub's eyes, a silent message that she could not quite put into words. For a moment, she forgot about the tense hall, the instructors, and even the other trainees watching. All she saw were the cubs, small, fragile, yet carrying themselves with surprising dignity. They had not just returned her belongings, they had given them back in a way that spoke louder than words. Around her, the others shifted quietly, whispering to one another, unsure what to make of the scene. Some looked puzzled, others amazed. The instructors themselves held their ground, their faces unreadable, but their eyes showed curiosity. They had trained long enough to know when something simple carried a larger meaning. The trainee bent down slowly, her hands brushing the straps of the bag. She wanted to say thank you, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she gave the cubs a small nod, her eyes softening. To her surprise, the cubs lowered their heads even more, as though acknowledging her gesture in return. It was a simple act, yet it carried the weight of trust. In that moment, the cubs were no longer just learners or followers. They had chosen to show something on their own, something that could not be taught in drills or shouted through commands. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect, of everyone realizing they had just witnessed something meaningful. The young human felt both shocked and touched, holding not only her backpack again, but also a memory she knew she would never forget. The hall remained still, every eye fixed on the cubs and the backpack lying neatly at the human trainee's feet. For a moment, the scene seemed almost too simple to carry such weight. Yet its meaning began to grow clearer in the minds of those watching. Slowly, whispers faded, and silence returned. Not the tense silence of uncertainty, but the kind that comes when truth begins to reveal itself. The group started to understand. The cubs had not wandered away out of carelessness. They had not broken formation because of mischief or distraction. They had left for a reason, a purpose that none of the humans had expected. They had gone to guard what mattered to one of their own, the young trainee's backpack. This realization spread like fire through dry grass. Confusion melted away, replaced by something deeper. The cubs, in their small way, had shown loyalty. They had chosen to step out of line, not for themselves, but for the human who had shared space, training, and small moments of connection with them. It wasn't about the bag itself. It was about what it represented. They understood its importance to her, and they had taken it upon themselves to protect it. The young trainee felt her chest tighten with emotion. She had been worried, even suspicious, when her belongings first disappeared. Now, as she looked into the cub's lowered eyes, she realized they hadn't stolen her things. They had carried them as guardians, not as mischief makers. A wave of respect and gratitude washed over her, leaving her both humbled and touched. The instructors, too, exchanged looks, but these were no longer filled with worry. Instead, there was recognition, an unspoken agreement that something meaningful had just taken place. They had drilled discipline into the group every morning, but here, without orders or commands, the Cubs had displayed a lesson of their own. A lesson about trust, care, and silent respect. Among the trainees, the mood shifted. Where there had been unease and doubt, now there was admiration. The Cubs were no longer seen as careless little ones who had disrupted the roll call. They were seen as loyal companions who had acted with purpose. Even the faintest doubts were replaced by quiet nods of respect. The young trainee bent to pick up her backpack, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the Cubs once more, and this time her eyes shone with something more than relief. They shone with understanding. She gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and though no words were spoken, the bond between her and the Cubs deepened in that moment. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer heavy. It was filled with respect, with the quiet acceptance that the Cubs had acted not out of mischief, but out of loyalty. What had started as confusion ended with a simple truth. The smallest among them had shown the greatest reminder that respect is earned not through words, but through actions. From that day forward, the story of the Cubs and the backpack lived on. It was told in the dining hall after long shifts, whispered in the barracks before lights went out, and even mentioned during training exercises when discipline was tested. It was no longer just about a bag or 3 Cubs. It was about what their actions revealed. The lesson was simple yet powerful. Loyalty does not always appear in grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it shows itself in quiet actions, like small paws carrying something heavy, like young hearts choosing to protect instead of play. The Cubs had broken formation, but they had done it not to rebel, not to misbehave, but to guard something precious for a human they had come to respect. The young trainee who had once thought her belongings lost now carried more than just her backpack. She carried a memory, a reminder that respect flows both ways. She realized that the Cubs saw her not as someone separate, but as part of their own circle. That silent understanding became one of the strongest lessons of her training, one that no manual or drill could have ever taught. As the weeks passed, others repeated the tale, adding their own reflections. Some spoke of the Cubs' loyalty, others of the bond forming between humans and those who had once been seen only as learners or followers. Every retelling gave the story a life of its own, making it grow into something more than just a moment in a hall. The instructors, too, began to reference it when reminding trainees about discipline. But they didn't speak of it as an example of breaking rules. Instead, they spoke of it as a reminder that discipline also includes knowing when to act with heart. They reminded the group that true strength isn't only about standing in line, it is also about protecting one another when the time calls for it. The Cubs, of course, never understood the depth of the story the way the humans did. Yet every time they walked beside the trainee, there was a quiet pride in their steps, as if they somehow knew they had left a mark that day. And every time she looked at them, she felt the same, an unspoken gratitude for the lesson they had given her without ever saying a word. The story lasted long after the moment had passed. It became a shared memory, a living reminder of what loyalty looks like when it is pure and selfless. And so, whenever doubt or confusion appeared in training, someone would recall that day, the day 3 Cubs broke formation not to disobey, but to prove that loyalty sometimes shines brightest in the smallest actions.